On the 26th of November 1908, Dutch naval vessels at full strength sailed out of the harbor of Willemstad, Curaçao. Their destination, Venezuela. The ships had orders to stop and capture any Venezuelan vessel they encountered. The Netherlands had enough of the harassment and threats that the Venezuelan government has been indulging in for years. It was time to put an end to this. This here is the story of how the Netherlands and Venezuela almost went to war in 1908. Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, my name is Stefan. I'm a Dutch history teacher and I make videos about history for you. And I love to cover the lesser known niche topics regarding history. Key figure of this story was Jose Cipriano Castro Ruiz, then president of Venezuela. He was 50 years old and originally from the mountainous province of Táchira in western Venezuela bordering Colombia. Although he belonged to the Spanish-speaking middle class, Cipriano Castro prided himself on his Indian origins. His supporters created the myth of an Andino, hardened by the elements, who combined the European education with the toughness of a native. In the 1870s, Castro became involved in politics. Since gaining independence from Spain in 1829, Venezuela had been shaken by one revolution after another. Castro rose to lead an autonomous revolutionary government in Táchira, but in 1892 he was forced to flee to Colombia. 7 years later, he returned with a guerrilla army. In October 1899, Castro entered Caracas as the victor. Although his revolution was nominally intended to restore liberalism in Venezuela, Castro ruled just as dictatorially as his conservative predecessors. He had two major role models. The first was a legendary independence hero, Simón Bolívar, who was of Venezuelan origin. Second, Castro had an excessive admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte. Like the former French Emperor, Castro was short in stature and liked to be called the Little Corporal. The inhabitants of Caracas could often see him riding through the streets, imperially seating on a white horse. Dictator Cipriano Castro developed into an international nuisance. For most Venezuelans, this spectacle was about the only pleasure they derived from their president. Their country, economically and financially exhausted after decades of revolutions and civil wars, was further drained to finance Castro's extravagant lifestyle. According to the Dutch Social Democrat parliamentary Henry van Kool, who published an account of his travels through the Caribbean in 1904, Castro hosted orgies in his palace, and no woman was safe from his desires. Van Kool called Castro a Nero in miniature. US Secretary of State Elijah Root described him as a deranged brute. Opponents of Castro's regime were imprisoned, murdered, or fled abroad. One traditionally popular refuge was Curaçao. The three Leeward Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, had come into the hands of the Dutch West India Company in the 17th century. The largest of the three, Curaçao, was the most economically profitable thanks to transatlantic trade in enslaved people and exotic goods. Because Spain forbade all trade between its vast colonies and other powers, Willemstad was able to fill the gap and became an important trading hub. Over the course of the 18th century, however, Spain also opened its ports to foreign ships. Moreover, the Dutch faced competition from the British, who began trading with the South American mainland from Trinidad. As a result, Willemstad lost much of its former glory. The growing unrest in the Spanish territories, where nationalists sought to free themselves from the grip of the mother country, the early 19th century, offered new opportunities for the Dutch islands. They played an important role for the rebels as springboards, places of refuge and transit points for illegal arms shipments. In 1806, the Venezuelan general and rebel Francisco de Miranda withdrew to Aruba with some 300 comrades. In 1812, Simón Bolívar, fleeing the Spanish army, stopped in Curaçao. When the revolution in Venezuela succeeded, in 1829, the good relations between the new regime and the Dutch Antilles translated into diplomatic recognition and a trade treaty. Yet, mutual irritations soon arose. Bolívar understood better than anyone the risk that Willemstad, as a smuggling hub and potential refuge for political dissidents, posed to the security of his regime. He wanted to curb smuggling and promote the domestic economy by demanding high import duties in the trade treaty with the Netherlands and excluding small vessels. Bolívar's proposal did not succeed, but the tone was set. After Venezuela withdrew from the Republic of Gran Colombia in 1830, bilateral relations remained difficult and complex. The Netherlands not only had to take Caracas into account, but also public opinion in the Antilles. While The Hague tried to remain friendly with the Venezuelan government, the island's population sided with the opposition. Because they were economically dependent on smuggling, the Netherlands could neither decisively oppose it nor truly wanted to. Venezuela responded from time to time by seizing suspected smuggling vessels sailing under the Dutch flag, which in turn was answered by demonstrative naval exercises by the Dutch Navy. To prevent escalation, the Netherlands decided in 1870 to comply with a request from Venezuelan President Monagas to extradite his political rival Antonio Guzman Blanco, who was planning a coup from Curaçao. The decision boomeranged on the Dutch authorities. Within a short time, Blanco and his supporters seized power in Caracas. The new president was determined to make the Dutch pay for his extradition. It began with Blanco ordering the seizure of several Dutch merchant ships on suspicion of smuggling. When the Dutch chargé d'affaires in Caracas protested, he was expelled from the country, and after rebels against Blanco's regime were supplied from Curaçao in 1874, the president closed the ports of Coro and Maracaibo to Dutch ships. 7 years later, Venezuela introduced a 30% import tax on all goods transported from European colonies in the Caribbean. These so-called Antilles duties were intended to eliminate foreign competition for Venezuela's own ports. Willemstad suffered badly from these measures. According to Van Kool, the once prosperous Curaçao had become a distressed island. Ships lay idle, plantations fell into decay. The condition of this Dutch colony is beginning to look hopeless. Around the turn of the century, calls arose for a drastic solution to the Antillean problem. There is something in the air, Van Kool wrote in 1904. There were two powers, both newcomers to the global political stage, that might have been interested in Curaçao. First were the United States. After reaching its ultimate continental boundaries, the country sought opportunities for overseas expansion. As early as 1823, President James Monroe had declared the entire Western Hemisphere off limits to European colonizers. At the end of the 19th century, the Americans took possession of Spanish territories in the Philippines and the Northern Caribbean. The construction of the Panama Canal made the rest of the Caribbean region economically and strategically vital as well. The second new great power seeking a foothold in South America was, curiously enough, Germany. After the German Empire was proclaimed in Versailles in 1871, the highly industrialized country, home to Europe's largest population, went in search of raw materials and overseas markets. In Africa and, to a lesser extent, Asia, the Germans succeeded in establishing colonies of their own. But the Western Hemisphere, this possibility was extremely limited. Any attempt to bring already decolonized South American countries under German control would inevitably lead to conflict with other great powers, especially the United States. Germany therefore chose a different approach. The government in Berlin sought to establish strong economic and diplomatic relations with the former Spanish colonies and thus increase its influence in that part of the world. German companies invested millions of marks in Venezuela, and a large German community emerged in the town of Tovar. That the government in Caracas preferred Germans over Dutch as neighbors became clear when it suggested to Berlin 3 times in a row in 1875, 1879 and 1898 that Curaçao be occupied. German admirals were receptive to the idea, but time and again they ran into a veto from the Foreign Office, which wanted no quarrel with the United States. In March 1902, however, Kaiser Wilhelm II received a report from the German consul in Batavia, the Dutch East Indies, assuring him that the Netherlands would be willing to sell Curaçao. The emperor instructed his ministers to investigate the political consequences of such a deal. Berlin watched with envy the growing power of the Americans, who in turn had set their sights on the Danish islands of St. Thomas and St. Croix. The chief of staff of the German armed forces, Otto von Diederichs, was eager to make a counter move. He seriously considered whether Germany should attempt to acquire not only Curaçao but also Suriname, as a demarcation line at which American expansionism must come to a halt. Thanks to the warnings from the German ambassador in Washington about the likely US reaction, all these plans were shelved. The rapidly deteriorating relationship between Germany and Venezuela also played a role. After seizing power in 1899, Cipriano Castro developed into an international troublemaker who made a habit of antagonizing the great powers. As a result, they joined forces against him. In December 1902, the German, British, and Italian navies jointly imposed a naval blockade on the Venezuelan coast. No ship could enter or leave the country, and German battleships bombarded Venezuelan ports. The cause was Caracas's refusal to pay its enormous foreign debts. Although the Netherlands also had substantial outstanding claims, it did not officially participate in the blockade. It did, however, allow German warships to take on supplies in Willemstad. Because the United States did not intervene, despite the Monroe Doctrine, Castro was forced to back down. He agreed that the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague would examine the various debt claims. Incidentally, the Netherlands ended up at the back of the line when Venezuela's assets were divided. Although Castro had lost, the conflict with the imperialist powers boosted his popularity at home. Aware of this mechanism, and because he had not forgotten Dutch support for the blockade, Castro steered toward a new confrontation with The Hague. In October 1907, 5 Antillean vessels were seized by the Venezuelan Coast Guard on suspicion of smuggling. When the accusation proved unfounded, the crews were released, but they still had to pay heavy fines. The vessels had also been badly damaged by Venezuelan customs officials. In mid-May 1908, Castro issued a number of decrees that undermined trade between Curaçao and Venezuela. Curaçao captains were forced to transship their cargo in the inconveniently located port of Puerto Cabello, whereas they normally sailed to Coro and Maracaibo. Small trading vessels were barred from all ports. The conflict escalated after an interview given by the Dutch consul in Caracas. Due to a translation error by the Venezuelan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Castro was told that he had called him an evil spirit in deeply religious Venezuela. This was an unforgivable insult. On the 20th of July 1908, the Dutch diplomat was ordered to leave the country along with other Dutch diplomats. For the Dutch government, led by the anti-revolutionary Prime Minister Theo Heemskerk. This was the final straw. The Hague issued Castro an ultimatum. If he did not withdraw his decrees before the 1st of November, Venezuela would face the consequences. Meanwhile, Dutch diplomats checked the reaction of the United States should the Netherlands resort to military action. The US raised no objections as long as the Netherlands did not occupy Venezuelan territory. As expected, Castro refused to yield. Now it was The Hague's turn. The government ordered the Navy to put to sea. From the 26th of November 1908 onward, Dutch warships patrolled the Venezuelan coast with the aim of intercepting every vessel flying the Venezuelan flag. 2 Coast Guard ships, the Alix and the 23 de Mayo, were seized and laid up in Willemstad. The blockade was a textbook example of gunboat diplomacy. Initially, it was a punitive measure, but The Hague hoped for more. In Caracas, Cipriano Castro's position was under pressure. His own vice premier, Juan Vicente Gómez, a wealthy landowner who had previously financed Castro's revolution, now turned against him. With the blockade, the Netherlands hoped to accelerate political developments in Venezuela and force a change of regime. It succeeded, although other factors weighed more heavily. Even before the blockade began, Castro had traveled to Europe for medical treatment. Gómez seized his opportunity and took power. The upheaval was not bloodless, however, and during street fighting between supporters of Gómez and Castro, 3 large pharmacies owned by a Dutchman were looted. Compensation for the damage would be disputed with the new regime for years. Nevertheless, the Netherlands could speak of a successful operation. The new President Gómez immediately struck a different tone from his predecessor and emphasized the importance of good international relations. On the 21st of December 1908, he withdrew Castro's controversial decrees. 2 days later, the Dutch recalled its fleet to port. For the Venezuelans, the latest change of power brought little improvement. At first, Gómez appeared to grant the population more freedoms, but in the 1920s, he too developed Castro-like traits. Venezuela became a police state that spied on its own population and crushed any hint of opposition with violence and imprisonment. While Gómez and his foreign allies amassed fortunes from commercial oil production, which took off in the early 20th century, the vast majority of Venezuelans lived in poverty. During the Second World War, Venezuela had an interesting position because of its oil. Click here to find out.